Welcome to Where's My Sandal podcast, where four young men explore societal and cultural issues. This is Zhang.
This is Shi.
This is Juan.
This is Meng.
Welcome to our podcast.
All right. Hi, everyone. Today we are going to be touching base and talking about toxic masculinity. So just right off the bat, we want to help define the definition and explain what toxic masculinity is. So toxic masculinity is really defined as a culture that is rooted around traditional male gender roles and masculine gender norms, right? So a lot of what we see and what we talk about when we are exploring toxic masculinity is ideologies around violence, being unemotional, the idea of being sexually aggressive or sexual aggression, sexism, homophobia, ideologies around power, maintaining power, and being dominant. So with that note, we want to kind of dive in a little bit and share some examples of what we've seen in our lifetime and what we feel are examples of what toxic masculinity is.
Well, I think for me, when I first think about toxic masculinity, I don't have a specific example, but like what makes it toxic is when there is a disproportionate, I guess, degree of like power or control over a certain relationship. Whether we're talking about environmental or between humans and the earth or anything like that, like it the power dynamics come to a degree where it's unhealthy for one person or both parties, right? I think that's probably a good place to start. Where that's something that makes it toxic is that, especially when we're talking about like men and women, like there's a disproportionate dispersal of like power or control in the relationship, and oftentimes it comes from social pressures of what masculinity is, like how we kind of misconstrue what is how to properly be a man and what isn't a man, right?
So what I'm hearing you say is masculinity itself is not toxic.
I don't think so. Not in it by itself.
It's when it hurts. I think us and the community.
Because at least from my background, what I've read while studying social theory, like masculinity and femininity are kind of like yin and yang. If there's equilibrium and there's a balance, then there's supposed to be harmony. Especially like in the Hmong culture, there are definitely gender roles, but there isn't a, like we were talking about the other day about Hmong men and like suicide, right? And part of it is if the Hmong community had a healthy patriarchal like system, then the power dynamics between the men and women wouldn't be disproportionately dispersed, where there would be a voice, there would be room for progress and change in the community for among women, but there isn't. And I think that's where what I think Meng, you had said that, in typical or traditional Hmong family, the wives and sisters have some sort of power as well in the relationship, but oftentimes it gets eclipsed by the Hmong male role and Hmong sons and how important sons are or boys are in the family versus how important women are, mothers are, grandmothers are in the family. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. I guess I'm kind of stuck at the ideology of like we shouldn't be too focused on like masculine. Not all masculinity is toxic, right? Because in essence, masculinity is a really large construct and concept, right? That includes a lot of different things. But in reality, right, absolutely like what Jean was saying, like every person has to have some balance of femininity and masculinity. And so when you don't have that aspect of femininity, or you think that femininity is bad or there's a negative connotation
or
with that,
not valued.
not valued, and you strive to be hyper masculine, which is what we see in a lot of our culture among younger men, then that's where you see a lot of toxic masculinity being created or establishing itself as a culture.
And did you want to briefly, I guess, describe or define what hypermasculinity is? I mean, it's pretty, like, for me, it's pretty self-explanatory, but just for anybody who's never heard of that
Yeah,
before.
so hypermasculinity, I mean, so there's a lot of different sociological definitions for it, but hypermasculinity is essentially just the idea of, taking whatever ideas are tradition, kind of like toxic masculinity, right? So traditional ideologies of what a man is or how a man's supposed to be, and then pulling that to the extreme, right? So if we say that men shouldn't be emotional, well, then someone who's hypermasculine, right, they're going to be very stoic. They're not going to cry. They're not going to show many emotions besides anger, right? And that's just one example of hypermasculinity. And we see that manifests itself in many different facets, right?
Yeah, like, you have to watch football, you have to drink beer,
Right.
you can't, do other
Right.
things.
Right.
Yeah.
So like it's even, and it's not even like hypermasculine, right? But then masculinity is, so if we're gonna talk about like examples of what we see or what we experience, right? So from just my grad school experience, right? One of my instructors or professors, when I was in class with them, they talked about how when you're meeting with male students, it's difficult for them to engage with you, right? And this is a sociological study. If they're sitting across from you and you're looking at each other face to face,
Oh, yeah, I've seen this
right?
before.
You
yeah.
heard this before, right?
Yep.
But then if you find a way to sit by each other, right?
Yep.
And like, so this is like socialization, right? So whether that's driving or you're fishing side by side, or you're watching TV on a couch side by side, like conversations tend to flow better and men are able to open up more. So even something as subtle as that, right, has gender
Like markers.
gender markers, right? Implications connected to it, right? So like that's something that I was exposed to eventually, right? And I was like, wow, like, huh, this is a thing.
Like, very subtle. Like, even to the way where men have conversations with each other, there are definitely gender markers where it makes men feel more or less comfortable, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so I guess, right, so what we're kind of wanting to do is try to think of examples that we've experienced or seen at the macro level, right? So we're talking about society, we're talking about community. What are some things that you guys have seen or experienced at a large level, right?
From from there to a little more micro in our community, like whether like marriages and divorces, like even when, let's just say, it's a domestic abuse kind of situation and the woman wants to leave the relationship, it's still pretty much like the decision isn't really hers. She wants to leave, but she has to, like, essentially get approval or get the men from her side to essentially validate the divorce. So even then, even when it's abusive and possibly even a dangerous situation, her life potentially is still in the hands of men, right?
Yeah, and even when she successfully gets divorced, she will still be viewed more, I guess, worse than the guy, the bundle,
Yeah, and I guess in that sense, like you said, it's she's viewed on worse than her partner, right? But that's where, if you look at it from a broader perspective, that's where it is. Masculinity is very toxic because they're both divorced, and obviously, let's just say it was a domestic abuse situation, right?
Mm-hmm.
The man is still not reprimanded for his behavior. If anything, he gets a free pass, but she will always be stigmatized as a divorcee, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where our community doesn't really talk about it, where we address domestic violence, where, hey, that's not okay. We need to address that kind of behavior. Whereas, boys will be boys, I guess, in this situation, and he gets a free pass. And I think that's a good example in our community where like the masculine traits have become toxic in the way that we give them free passes when we should be calling them out for bad behavior, especially if they're your uncles, they're your elders or something like that. We should be calling them out, and also from the other side where let's just say she goes back to her side, her clan, and her clan is telling her to go back.
Yeah.
They need to be called out as well for putting pressure on her to return to a situation that's potentially dangerous for her, right? Because at the end of the day, it's not about her safety. It's about bongjimo, or it's about our image, or our reputation. We can't have you come back, because if you come back, you're a divorcee, and there's nothing we can do for you. Whereas, we should probably think about her livelihood, her happiness, things like that. And then going off of that, like with weddings and divorces, even funerals, where when the person that dies, I haven't seen research out there yet on this, but like between men and women's funerals, I am almost sure that men's funerals are much longer, and there's much more money spent on men's funerals than women's funerals. Um, just from what I observe, I don't have any concrete evidence or research proof. But the way I've seen it, usually men's funerals go for 3 days at minimum, right? And usually it's anywhere from 40 to almost $100,000, depending on the person, what they did, so on and so forth. But for women, I've seen women only have like 1 day funerals, things like that. Um, and it has to do with the person that died and the pressure that's put on the family to make their funeral big, to make it grand, to celebrate the deceased's life, you know. And so that's another good example of how masculinity is really toxic in our community.
All right, and it's a collective, right? Because the decision makers at the end of the day are men.
Yes.
So.
Yep. So growing up, I've been around my dad a lot, seen Kusuku dad, do Tonojawa in the community. I seen it happen in my own house and the sessions, and I think just thinking back of all the things that I caught on learning from that, and I definitely, definitely admit that, for a long time, a lot of that was instilled into me because I learned it from that, how, you know, the men were making decisions for the woman that, especially when she didn't do anything wrong.
I mean, I guess to sum up a lot of what we're talking about, like masculinity and power all comes back to like a sense of control, right? With a lot among men, it's about control, whether it's for their wives or their family, or just their environment. It all comes back to this dynamic of power and control, right? And somehow, if you aren't able to control the things that happen around you, whether it's your wife or your family or your kids, then you are somehow less of a man, right? Even though like all these dynamics are living and breathing people, you can't control everything, but somehow like if you can't control every little aspect of it, then somehow you're looked down upon by like our community, and it's essentially you're less of a man, right? If you can't have control over things. So even this concept of us as if you're not married, you could be like 50 years old, but if you've never gotten married like legitly in the Hmong community, you're still seen as a boy, right? So it's almost like you're looked down upon, but also the community doesn't give you any sort of like power or any sort of authority, even if it's like over your own family, because obviously you don't have a family, you don't have control over something, so you're not a man yet. Like, would that be fair?
Yeah, I mean, like Hmong culture, we have a term, right? Like you have to be to teach right? And in order to do that, you have to be able to make decisions. You have to be able to control situations, whether that's like family members, relationships between different people. But that's kind of the role and responsibility that you're given, right? And that's definitely a traditional gender role.
but I think specifically for just like family dynamics, though, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, like in reality, I've known people or men who hold like high visible positions where they're like a high supervisor or director of some sort of program or over employees or persons,
Mm-hmm.
but because in the community they're not like they don't have a family yet, they still don't aren't seen as someone who is worthy of being a man.
I think we should also talk about, just to open up this topic more and make it more accessible, we should talk about like generalizations or ideas, right? That you hear a lot, right? So examples are, and these are just phrases, right? Ideas like be a man, boys don't cry, ideology of like man up, right? Right, like so, like derogatory terms like that, where um, so like those are some examples of just phrases that you hear growing up. Are there like any other phrases that you guys heard growing up?
Sơ sâu có buồn, lúc nó nói không biết, có chứ, có lúc nó.
So typey.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah,
what does that mean?
Don't lose to a woman, or pretty much don't be a bitch in Hmong.
Yeah,
Hmong
pretty
way.
much.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think for me, even just being left-handed, growing up, they all say, "Cause she pan and I'm like, oh,
Oh
Because,
yeah.
ever heard that if you're with too many women, you took a thing?
Nope.
No.
Yep.
Can you explain what that means?
I have no idea, but
When
I don't know where it came from, but
one, two.
this is basically if you're with too many girls, you'll grow a tail. But I'm not sure where it came from.
John,
I don't know where it
Right?
came from.
Yeah,
Yeah, but you heard
do
it.
you
But-
know what it means though?
No, I like for the opposite. If a girl's with too many boys, she like what the hell was this? Kotoku, no?
So a horn?
Maybe or something like that.
I got that a lot. I hung out with a lot of girls growing up.
But that kind of goes back to the idea, right? That like growing up, if you are more feminine or if you hang out with girls, it's all rooted in homophobia, right? Because it's like all like he's gonna be girly, and if he's gonna be girly, then he's gonna be gay.
Yeah.
And like traditional Hmong parents, that's like their fear.
Yeah.
Right.
or even
I don't-
like trans too, right? Like they would
Gay or
yeah,
trans,
gay,
yes.
trans,
Yep.
Is it?
it's not just limited to it.
I guess in the OG Hmong community, is it even recognized?
Homosexuality?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, so I don't think it's necessarily rooted in that, but maybe just the fact that you're learning feminine ways, right? You're learning from the women and not from your brothers, the men.
Well, okay, so
Well, how do we come to the conclusion that the Hmong community doesn't,
Because they don't
Like,
acknowledge it, right?
right? They don't acknowledge it, right? But then they know that like that
it
is
exists.
Yeah.
in their mind that's an abnormality,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like Hmong people, we don't have a term for it, right?
There
Thai
is.
people, we have a
Oh,
term for
yeah,
it,
Yeah.
right? So then once we move to Thailand, they learn the term gatoy, right?
Yep.
And that's essentially like gay.
Yeah.
But then that doesn't mean that like just because they didn't have a term for it or they didn't want to acknowledge it doesn't mean that like they were oblivious that
to the idea.
there is a certain identity or community that exists within our larger community, right?
Mm.
It's just what do you call it? Like it's like silencing, right? So if you silence this identity from existence or shun it from existence, that's kind of like the Hmong approach to a lot of things, right?
But I feel like in the Western culture, homophobia is more prevalent.
Yeah.
Or, like, for me and my understanding how like we create identities is that in order to understand what you are, you have to first understand what you're not, and that's where a lot of sexism comes in, right? In order for your son to be a boy, you have to teach him not to be a girl, right? And that's where a lot of sexism comes in.
Mm-hmm.
However, I feel like a lot of the homophobia that I learned, in, at least for me personally, was rooted in Western culture, where like I'm trying to I don't even think I have any sort of like understanding of what homosexuality is in
Hmong
Hmong,
culture.
well, even Hmong language.
Sure.
Like, and I'm not saying that there isn't any. It's
Mhm.
just me growing up, I don't remember hearing anything like that.
Oh, I guess I just want to be careful because I don't want to say like the Hmong culture is safe from homophobia.
No,
Or
Yeah, no,
we
that's
don't
not
touch it,
not.
right?
No,
Because-
if anything, it's so bad that they don't
Yes.
even acknowledge that it
Acknowledge it,
exists.
yeah.
Right.
I think that's what we were trying to
So
say.
yeah.
Okay.
So,
So,
to
like, we're all-
clarify,
So it sounds like we are talking about the same thing.
yeah,
Um,
it's if
but
anything,
I definitely do
yeah.
agree with you. I think like within the Western culture, right, or you know, if we're gonna be specific, like in the United States here, I think where we learn a lot of our homophobia growing up, or is definitely through school.
Yep.
Through peers in school, right?
Yep.
Even when we were growing up, like in middle school, right, the phrase like "that's so gay"
Yep.
was very common,
Oh yeah.
and it was used in like a derogatory way.
Mm-hmm.
And so like my very first encounter with homophobia was when I was in elementary school. My grandpa always said, "Hey, tuck your shirt in," because Pae tucks in their shirt. So like Pae is a hero. So I would always tuck in my shirt, and my friends like, "John, why do you always tuck in your shirt?" Like, I don't know, because that's what good guys do. No, man, you look like a F, for
Mhm.
for gay people, right?
Yeah.
It's like I'm like, okay, I don't know what that is, but that sounds bad. So I untucked my shirt.
And this is like a peer in
Yeah,
school.
yeah.
How old were you at this time?
I was probably in first grade.
Yeah, so like holy shit, right? Like
Yeah.
first grade, and you learn these kind of
Like what?
ideologies.
Yeah,
already.
that's a bad thing.
Right.
Yeah. And so I mean, like, here is someone in my family, my grandpa, elder. So yeah, this is okay. This is good. And then here's someone from the outside community is like, hey, you look like you're homosexual.
Right.
Whereas I think you brought up this is where cross culturally it's a little bit different. Where I remember last week we were talking about friendships and said our parents, our grandfathers, they would walk around with their friends and they hold hands.
Mhm.
It's
Yeah.
not that weird,
Mm-hmm.
right? Touching each other, giving each other hugs, things like that was not seen as a public display of affection
Mhm.
or of the sexual nature.
Sure.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in the Western culture, like if you put your arms around one of your buddies and it gets like if they get weirded out by it, that's
Or even holding hands.
or
Yeah.
even holding hands,
Mhm.
like that's like homophobic, because we're guys, we're not supposed to be doing things that express affection for each other like that because that's not appropriate.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, right? And that's rooted in, like, to circle back, right? That's rooted in those ideologies of
Yeah.
what it means to be a man.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess what it means to be a man, and just thinking of what it means to be a man in the Hmong culture and in Western culture.
Mhm.
There's a lot of similar traits. At the same time, it's a lot different.
Yeah, can you delve into that for us?
I don't know. It was more of a question for you guys, really.
Hey, so what was the question?
I guess it was more of a comment that Hmong culture and Western culture, masculinity looks different.
Yeah.
Like, they ebb and flow, and they intersect at certain points, but then they're also different at
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, if you, what was it? If you go and if anybody goes on YouTube and they look up, what is an attractive man from this country, this country, this country, this country, right?
Mhm.
The looks and the preferences are different,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Western culture mostly like burly, furry haired, like facial haired men,
Mm-hmm.
usually blonde haired or blue
Square
eyes,
jaws.
square jaw,
Yeah.
very
bulky.
fit.
Yeah.
But in a lot of different like Asian countries, like more like BTS.
Yeah.
Like, that's the
Like slender, clean cut.
yeah, slender, clean cut, very well
So-
groomed.
Going back to what I was thinking about, I guess in Western culture, being a man is not being a woman. Well, yeah, because being a woman is, I guess it makes you feminine or not less of a man. And then I guess same thing in the Hmong culture, but it's a little different, right? It's rooted in culture. You don't want your boy to be a woman because you want them to be a man to carry out cultural stuff. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean,
It's rooted. Western culture. Is
I
rooted
agree.
in
I
not
agree
being
that there
gay.
are like discrepancies between the two cultures. Would you say that's kind of like in the Hmong culture, you want your boys to become men, straight men at that, and marry on because you want them to carry your yeah, right, your
Progeny.
legacy, your family line,
Yeah.
because Hmong people are very like focused on that, right?
Yeah.
Whereas in the Western culture, I guess that would not be like the primary thought for a lot of people.
I mean, I guess in the Western culture, if you're a feminine, you're just gay. I guess in the Hmong culture, it's a little
To
different.
society, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Doesn't mean that like if you are feminine, you are
Right, right,
absolutely
yeah.
gay.
And
Yeah.
so in the Hmong culture, it's a little different, right? I guess going back to what we said, Hmong culture don't really acknowledge, you know, being gay and that stuff. And so that's not even a thought, right? If so, I guess in the Western culture, if you're feminine, you're gay. Um, or the thought that's the thought. But in the Hmong culture, if you're feminine, you just can't do the men work. I don't know.
Would you say the Hmong culture didn't have a way to define this until
Like recently.
yes?
Possibly. I mean, we'd have to talk to OG because I feel
Mm.
like you said, it'd be impossible for them not to know. You know. So I mean, like,
Guess it's something that's beyond us.
Because there's these old stories, right, where like I've heard some OGs explain a long time ago when because we've done like events where we've talked to them about just gender spectrum and sexual orientation and ideas like that, and OGs have said in the past and like so when I was growing up, right, like we had these people in our village and there were these two men, they never got married but they were really close to each other, but of course they can't be together either because that is ostracized in the community, right? Or it's like, oh yeah, a long time ago we had these two aunts. They never got married, but they lived together. Whereas that's more normalized because it's like, oh well, they're just women. So like, this elder who was explaining these stories to us, they're saying like, oh yeah, when I was a kid, I did think that maybe we didn't have a term for it then, but then I did think that maybe they didn't want to marry a man or a woman because they were in love with the person that they were already living with. And I was like, okay, yeah, like,
or like their best friend.
right. Or like, yeah, they're really good friends, and they just never got married, right? So like, that's why I want us to also be cautious about it, right? Because it's like, I don't want to erase people that did exist.
Essentially, we don't want to give the Hmong community, the Hmong culture, a free pass.
Yes.
Because there really is no way for them not to have known about it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So another thing that we mentioned earlier, right, is this idea of emotions and not showing emotions, especially this idea of not crying, because crying makes you weak, right? And so growing up, like for me, I've heard so many times that like don't cry. That's what women do, right? Don't cry. You're a man, right? And like for the longest time in my life, like I internalized that message. Um, so I guess just curious how if you guys have heard similar messages and how you've come to like navigate those kind of messages in your life, because that's like a dominant narrative that boys hear.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of those messages. Fortunately for me, I grew up around a lot of women, and girls. I mean, girls back then, but yeah, grew up around a lot of girls. Got the don't got that a lot. Got the crying and be a man a few times, but I don't know. I just thought that was just something to cheer me up and make me not cry. So I never really bought into those stuff. But that's just me. So how about you guys?
I mean, I've heard it. I have tons of cousins, male cousins and stuff. So it was like we were pretty rough and stuff, and we heard some of that stuff too. Like you, fortunately, I grew up with a lot of women as well, and so I feel, and it's tough because it's such a long time ago now.
Mm.
That it's hard to remember, but like I feel that for me there was a good balance, but then like even my brothers and stuff were I'm the youngest son, so if I cried a little bit, it was kind of expected because I was the baby.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
But I still did hear a lot of those messages as well.
Yeah, and I want to go back to what I said. I mean, not that I didn't buy it. I guess I was more immune to it. Not immune, but I don't know what's the word for it. But I guess I'd say I'm not immune to it.
Would you say that it was like more normalized for you?
Yeah, and the message probably, I don't know. I guess.
Like it didn't come off in like a masculine way, but more in like a comforting way, like the way you interpret
Yeah,
it.
but I'm sure I'm not immune to internalizing,
Yeah,
not internalizing those
I mean,
those
none of us
messages.
are.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I was an angry kid, and I had temper tantrum. So whenever my dad, or when I, even my older brother told me, "就是过啊," because and then I saw that as personally for my own ego, my masculine. Oh, so now that I'm not crying, I still have the power to beat up my younger siblings more.
Sure.
And it was weird. And
So you just like shock them and clench your
Yeah,
fist, and
yeah,
you just
clench
like,
your fist,
I'm
yeah.
just gonna use rage
yeah,
to
rage,
overcome my sadness or
Yeah.
the other emotions.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, which is a good point. You push some emotions down, and you only allow other emotions to erupt to the surface, right?
Yeah.
And so you value one emotion over the other. When sometimes we all know that the healthy thing to do is to sit there in that feeling and like be okay with it.
Right.
And that's not a bad emotion. Versus just switching and going to a different one right away.
Yeah, well, which was bad, because I threw in more tantrum,
Yeah.
So.
Because you got away with it.
Yeah, because I got away with it.
Because you got away
yeah.
with it, and no one got in your case when you were being like hyper masculine.
Yeah.
But then when you even showed an ounce of like
Sadness. A little bit of sadness, a little bit of crying,
right, and then they came at you. Yeah.
So I feel like what you brought up is actually a good kind of it's branch off a little bit, and like feel free to come and bring it back if we have to. But
No, it's good. Go for it.
with mental health, where we see all this like mass shootings and all these, which majority are like men, right? Like, what happens when we don't ever get the chance or opportunity to wrestle with emotions or feelings that are seen as like not masculine, right? Which is sadness or depression or crying. If we never have been given the opportunity to wrestle with these emotions, and by the time we're older and those emotions erupt to the surface,
Right. You learn one outlet for it, right?
yeah, we only learn one outlet, which is anger, right? So we've been taught real quick, when you feel depression, flip that switch, go to anger. When you feel sadness, flip that switch, clench your jaw, feel something else, which is more masculine.
Yeah. No, I think you bring up a really good point there, right? Because we want to be really careful when we talk about mental health
Yep.
and like perpetrators and mass shooters,
Mhm.
because mass shooting is not a result of mental health, and that's what our
Yeah.
society gets wrong, right? And you already hit it on the head, right?
Yep.
It's the lack of care for mental health that gives the only outlet for these men, right? And their only outlet is hypermasculinity.
Yep.
And then that is the result, right? Violence, anger, confrontation, because that's the only way they know how to express themselves, because they don't have an outlet or a way of understanding and navigating
Navigating those.
their mental health.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So
Yeah.
So I mean, I guess sounds like toxic masculinity is mental health issues.
Well, I would be really
I don't know.
careful about that.
It's more
Yeah.
of the salience of hypermasculinity. Whenever you see traits that are more feminine, you kind of flip that switch and you become quote unquote more masculine, right?
Right.
And so a really good example is like if you ever go to Checker Bar, and like we all have the friend where we're all sitting there having a drink. You look across the bar, and your friend's like, "Man, that guy is mad dogging me." It's like, bro, like that guy's not even looking at you.
Right.
Why do you like for that person? Why does that person, who you don't even know, when they look at you, makes you feel so offended and threatened that it creates these emotions in you to go over there and create a physical altercation just to prove to yourself or to other people that you're a man. Yeah. You don't even know him. You've never even had words. He may not even have looked at you. It may have just been a glancing look.
Yeah, they could be like, "Hey, man, I like that guy's hair," right? And they're just like checking out your hair,
Or
and then
they-
you get all upset
Yeah,
about it.
or they might not be looking at you. They might have just been looking right across.
Yeah, like right through you, or right past you. Absolutely.
But like where we talk about hypermasculinity is where you overdo it. Where like when you feel threatened. So if you like to this person, they felt threatened, right? That person is mad dogging me, right? Trying to put me in my place.
Right.
So my job is to assert myself and make sure everyone knows that I'm a man, right?
Yeah.
And so going back to what we're talking about, even in yourself internally, when you start feeling these emotions or feelings that are quote unquote more feminine,
So you suppress them.
you have to reassert yourself in some way, shape, or form. At least that's what we're taught.
And that's like the same thing with mental health, right? So like that's why we gotta be really careful and not say like hypermasculinity, mental health are the same thing. They're very different things, right? Because when we're talking about mental health, that is literally like a condition or something within a person. Whereas when we're talking about toxic masculinity, it's like racism, right? It's socially constructed, right?
It's systemic.
It's systemic,
Yep.
right? So it's like you've heard in the past where people will try to default racism and say like, oh, like this person, they're just racist because they have a mental issue. It's not a mental issue. This is a cultural issue. This is a systemic issue, right? So that's to like destigmatize mental health, because mental health in itself is, it's something that isn't looked at deep enough. That's why it's a problem. It's something that we don't take serious enough. That's why it's a problem.
It's a
Hypermasculinity is another, and toxic masculinity. Those are another beast.
for another day. Yeah.
Right. And so we're kind of on this idea of like gun violence, right, and aggression. So like I feel like at a really young age we're taught that like we have to like fight if we want to survive, or like we have to fight for what is ours, right? At least for me, I feel like growing up, right? I grew up in like football culture, America, and then in high school even, right? Like just trying to navigate and survive the beast that is high school. I felt like I had to put on a facade, right, or like act like a certain way. I remember in middle school, like I really liked dressing and like looking like clean or sharp. I guess we would call it preppy now, right? But then like I remember like some friends, like they made fun of me. They called me like Metro, right? I don't know if you guys know what that term is, right?
That's essentially a guy that takes care of himself.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But then and then I got the nickname Metro Man, and that stuck with me for like a whole year, and that hurt me so bad. But now I look back, I'm like that's so silly, right? Because like, why was I so offended, and why did that hurt me so much? When essentially, like I wasn't doing anything wrong, right? Like I was just taking care of myself, and I look back, right, and it's one of those things where, in reflection, you're kind of disappointed by yourself, but then you also understand that that is who you were at the time. So at least for me, like I feel like navigating masculinity and trying to understand masculinity has kind of like damaged a lot of who I became and even parts of who I currently am.
I think what you hit on is I think the word, at least that like the emotion you feel, is like role performance. Because in high school, there's like obviously everyone's trying to conform to some sort of group identity, and where essentially what happened to you was a microaggression where they're trying to get you to perform or dress or talk a certain way, and especially when they called you out, like they called you out for failure to acknowledge to whether the way they dress, the way they talk, or whatever identity it was, that was a group, right? And so what results in that? And there's just me kind of listening to the story, kind of dissecting what happened in the situation. Essentially, you failed to adhere to their identity or perform in the way that you're supposed to. And when you do that, it's like you feel shame, you feel embarrassment. And in this case, it was you failed to dress and act and talk as a high school male would talk, which is kind of stupid. I mean, now and looking back,
Right, in retrospect, yeah.
In retrospect, it's stupid. But when you're in that situation and when your social identity and your self-esteem and feeling good in who you are and proud of who you are is all put into being able to successfully navigate those identities and those group dynamics, it is a huge failing. And the thing is, like, I can relate with you like so well because it could be something so stupid,
Yep.
and like in the next, like from year to year to year, the rules and the I guess adherence to the group identities always change. That's why it's so stupid.
Yeah.
That it's almost impossible to have a good self esteem when you're in high school. I feel like any kid
Mhm.
So,
who was in high school had like really low self esteem.
Yeah.
so I couldn't relate to the dressing part because being preppy or pretty boy was a thing.
Right.
Where I was-
Where you were at, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, so I mean, you
Um,
would have.
Yep. Different eras.
But-
yeah,
I can relate to being like, I guess, more feminine or having feelings and hating that part of myself. I remember I was dating this girl, and you know I was pretty emotional. And I guess by the time we were done, I kind of shut that part out of me, and still right now, like, still trying to find those parts back of. I mean, I allow myself to feel, but at the same time, it's there's a piece of me that's gone, right? That I've destroyed or locked away or whatever because I don't know. I thought it wasn't good enough, or it was too not manly enough, I guess, or something happened there where you just kind of lock it away. So similar but different, where you destroy part of yourself because you're not image of what society or wants you to be.
well, I think comes back to conformity, right?
Yeah.
When you start talking to your friends about your feelings, that's when they'll the more likely in a toxic masculinity environment,
Or if you can't talk to your friends about
you have either one nobody to talk to, or
Yeah.
when you try to talk to them, they'll shut you out.
Right.
Or yeah, and then guess what you do? You don't have an outlet,
Right.
and that's where a lot. I feel like for a lot of younger women in high school or growing up, when their friends are more receptive, I think for them emotionally they're a lot more healthy. Or at least they're healthier than most of us growing up.
Yeah.
Because they have those friends and outlets where they're not always trying to reinvent the wheel about how to process or navigate these things. Whereas when, like, for us, if we don't have anyone to talk to, we get isolated, and we put a lot of blames on ourselves. Like, somehow everybody, because they're acting stoic or like hard,
Mhm.
Yeah.
then
My fault, I
then
did.
somehow there's something wrong with me,
Yeah.
Right. Right.
because obviously no one else is emoting or expressing these
Feelings.
weaknesses, right?
Yeah.
And so sometimes all you need is for someone to be like, bro, I've had depression before, or I've been in that situation before. I've gone through breakups. I was a mess.
And just be okay talking about it.
Yeah, and the thing is, sometimes you just need that, and sometimes even with, among our friends, I hear, man, dude, crap, dude, my house is like fucking falling apart, man. I can't fucking do this. I'm like, bro, that was just me, man.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, you bring up a really good point, right? Because like in that situation, right, like toxic friends, they'd be like, well, why don't you learn how to do it, right? Whereas, if you take a more like thoughtful approach, you'd be like, well, what can I help with? Like, I don't know a lot either, but let's
Figure it out
let's
together.
figure it out, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you bring up a really good point of like different approaches to that.
Well, no, I guess the difference between how something is toxic
Mm-hmm.
and something isn't, or certain behaviors are toxic, certain behaviors aren't. And if you don't ever show that vulnerability where you're a human being, where you're three-dimensional, right? You're not just a man.
Yeah.
Right.
You're just hard, and you have all the tools in the world, and you drive a big truck, things like that. Like, if you could just like bring yourself down a little bit and be three-dimensional as a human being who likes a lot of different things, who have a lot of interests in a lot of different things other than just like football, beer, and women,
Mm-hmm.
you become a lot more like accessible to your friends, and
Yeah.
then it's a lot better for them emotionally. It's also a more dynamic and flexible relationship.
In a sense, you don't cut parts of your humanity out of yourself, right? Because
Yeah.
you're denying yourself certain things because of what you think
Yeah, that's a good way
you
to
should
frame
be.
it.
And so I guess I don't know.
It sounds like toxic masculinity is like suffering by yourself in silence, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
But then it's not just you, because every other guy is also suffering in silence,
Yeah.
and no one's willing to be the vulnerable one to voice up, um,
admit it.
and admit it, right? Because that's all it really takes.
I
And
mean,
then even if you want to be compassionate with that person,
yeah,
you also have to be vulnerable to be compassionate. Um,
yeah, and
so either way, it's like taking a risk, right?
yeah, and so I guess it's toxic when you deny yourself of that. I mean, I guess it's okay to think, don't cry, right? That's okay, right? To think, yeah, I shouldn't cry, but when you deny yourself of that, I guess that's when it becomes toxic, right?
I think I wouldn't say don't cry. I would say like I guess like
Well, it's kind of like you don't want to cry, but you cry. That's perfectly fine. Versus a don't cry because
it's not like what,
yeah,
it's
it's
not,
not
who
what you
you-
should do.
It's not who
be.
you're supposed to be.
Yeah, so that's
Yeah.
so that's why I was kind of getting at where the toxicness comes from. It controls you so much that it hurts you, which is your body is hurting, you're feeling
Yeah.
stuff, but at the same time you're not allowing it to feel it. So that's a toxic part about it.
You're saying like you're not being authentic to yourself then?
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. You're not being human because that's an aspect of being human
The
that you're
humanity.
denying from yourself.
Yeah,
It's
and
really powerful.
I think this thing I think the first thing we have to a good way to describe it so far is that toxic masculinity, or at least this unhealthy idea of masculinity, is a very rigid thing. It's very brittle. You can poke
Fragile.
hole. You can poke holes at it, and
Mhm.
it'll just break apart, right? Because it has to adhere to such like certainty and such rigid rules and
Right.
conformity that no one can ever be this version of masculinity, right?
I mean,
Or-
it's also because main hit on the nail. You're not authentic.
Yeah, it's this fake idea of what
Yeah.
a man is supposed to be. No one is ever like that. Not all the time,
Right.
Mhm.
right? Even the manliest man that we know, whatever that is never going to adhere to what a hyper masculine idea looks like, because that person doesn't exist.
Yeah.
But yet, all these men are still trying to be that person, and it's just like I said, it's not dynamic, it's not flexible, it doesn't give you room to be a human being.
It's exhausting,
It is exhausting.
right? Like, because you're performing all the time then.
And you don't know who you are.
Well, I think you kind of do know who you are, but you feel that it's wrong or that it's not right because you don't conform to the idea. Does that make sense? Like
Yeah.
somehow you have what is it, cognitive dissonance, where you have this feeling or this thought that doesn't connect or doesn't match in yourself.
Or it challenges like your
It-
preconceived
or
notions.
it challenges who you know who you're supposed to be.
I can
So-
see it in both situations, right? Because like, definitely, if you are a person who is very conscious of who you are and who you want to be, that situation, that sounds like that's what it would apply to what you're saying, Jean. And for one, like I think in your situation, what you're talking about, I could see people who envelop themselves so deeply in this ideology of what it means to be a man that ultimately, if you strip that away, they
don't-
really
yeah,
don't have
know
a
who
sense
they
of
are.
identity.
Yeah.
They
No,
don't know
that's-
who they are
gotcha,
at
yeah.
all.
Yeah, that's why I was getting
Yeah.
at more.
So like absolutely, I think it applies and it's situational. It's depending on the person.
And you don't get. It's almost like you don't even get to develop certain parts of yourself.
and we see that, right? Like, so we can talk about like certain parts of yourself, but then like if we're gonna talk about like, emotional health,
Mm-hmm.
mental health, right? And like those are things that you don't get to acknowledge and develop, like you said, or explore within yourself, because this cultural idea doesn't allow you to, or you think that it doesn't allow you to, and that's why it becomes so problematic and toxic to an individual.
And I think that actually goes back to what we talked about in our last session about murder suicide, right?
Yeah.
Where what happens when a young man loses control of his relationship
Right,
with
yeah.
his wife, his kids. He doesn't know his place within the family dynamics. He loses his sense of self, because he doesn't conform to this idea of what a man is anymore. what does he do? He does the only thing he can do, murder suicide, right? So I think that's a great point.
And that framework of thinking sounds very similar to like the ideology or the framework of thought for mass shooters, right?
Yeah.
It's like their entire existence comes into question. And they feel like there's only one outlet for it at the end, right? And that goes back to this idea of violence as the only answer to anything.
Thanks again for tuning into our podcast, Where's My Sandal? Feel free to subscribe to us on YouTube and follow us on Facebook. Have a great rest of your week.